Hi everyone, this is I am elect Robbie Adamson, and today we're going to be covering the Benko Gambit decline lines on move 5. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and this is the second video that I've done on the Benko Gambit. The first one was on the Benko Gambit accepted lines, and this will be an overview of the Benko Gambit decline lines on move 5, not to be confused with the decline lines on move 4. So let's take a look. D4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, b5. Okay, so this is the Benko Gambit that we talked about in the first video. C takes b, a6, and instead of playing b takes a, which is all the accepted variations, black is going to decline, or white's going to decline the gambit. We're going to cover 4 different variations. We're going to cover knight c3, which is the Zaitsev variation. We're going to cover the f3 line, which is known as the Dlugy variation, named after Grandmaster Max Dlugy. There's the move e3, which is known to be a solid line, although I think it has a lot of teeth, and black has to be very, very careful. And then the final decline line we're going to look at on move 5 is we're going to cover b6. And b6 is probably the most common of the decline lines, especially amongst the top players. You don't see many of the top players playing anything else. So let's take a look at the Zaitsev variation. Knight to c3. And this line is very provocative in that when black takes back AB, white doesn't take back on b5 with the knight. He simply plays e4. So this is what I call game on. Basically, white's saying, I'm going to try to steamroll you in the center. Now, black has to be principled here. It makes no sense to play a move like d6 because white could just simply take the pawn with check, and that's not exactly what black is aiming for. So black actually has to play with energy himself, and so black plays b4, knight to b5, and then black plays d6. Okay? And this is going to be the beginning of the analysis, except we have to cover one little tactical trick just in case any of you were asking why doesn't black take on e4. We're going to pause the video for a few seconds and see if you can see why knight takes e4 is not good. And knight takes e4 is not good because white has the move queen e2. One of my students and very good friends who will go nameless had this in a game once and just didn't see what was going on, and he played knight f6, and then knight d6 check was played. And that is a smothered mate and an embarrassment and just something you can't live down, and I still don't let him live it down to this day. So what black has to do here basically is play d6. In this position there are 2 main lines for white. There's bishop c4, which is called the Nescafé Frappe attack. That's F-R-A-P-P-E. And then there's also the more typical of the lines, which is bishop f4. Interestingly, even though bishop f4 is the most typical, I have faced bishop c4 the most of any of these lines by far. I think I've only faced bishop f4 once in my entire life. So bishop c4. Bishop c4 has some interesting teeth to it. First of all, if black plays the move g6, okay, that's the typical way of playing this position, and we're going to cover that in a second. The best move is nbd7, and we're going to cover why in a second, and it'll be obvious after we cover the first move, which was g6, as to why white likes those positions. And then finally, there's a little bit of a tactical exercise that I think is more advanced. And you're going to have to figure out, why is knight takes e4 not good? Seems to win a pawn. If white plays queen e2, black simply plays knight f6. And unlike the last position, where the pawn was here, this pawn being on d6 is quite significant because, of course, the queen can now take on d6 if white does that. So I had this in a lot of blitz games with a master that lives here locally back when I was in college, and I fell into this trap many, many times. bishop f4, and I thought, well, I was fine, so I just play rook a6 here. So we're going to pause the video for a second, and let's see if you can find the tactical reason that black is in trouble here. So pause the video. Okay, the answer is white simply takes on d6 anyway. Okay, rook takes d6. And then not bishop takes d6 because black takes back, but white throws in this little intermezzo, bishop b5 check, which is very strong. Because now, if black blocks with either the knight or the bishop, we simply just take the rook for free. And so basically we have run interference, blocking the queen from guarding the rook. So that's part of the problem. And if rook to d7 here, we don't take the rook, but in fact we just simply take the knight for free, and then we can come take this guy later. So this is just a total disaster. I fell for this trap a couple of times, and I eventually learned my lesson. So you can't grab the pawn. It doesn't make sense to grab the pawn. And if your opponent's offering you a pawn, you probably need to look at it really carefully before you decide to take and be so provocative as to not developing your pieces and going pawn hunting. So nbd7 is the best move, as we talked about. But what happens if g6? g6 is very interesting because white will then play e5. D takes e. d6. Black has to take again because knight c7 is a threat. And then white plays this move, bishop g5. I'm not going to go any further in terms of what the theory says about this, because that's not really the point of the video. I will tell you that black's best move, and he has to find it, is rook a5. Okay, if you found that, congratulations. But really, white has the threat of just simply to take here and play knight to c7, winning a rook. And he also has as a threat queen f3, hitting this knight and hitting this rook. I had this once in my life. I had it against Joe Feng, who's an international master from New Hampshire, in the 94 95 New York Open, somewhere around there. And I got this, and after he played e5 and d6, I had remembered that I had studied this, but I'd kind of forgotten all the theory. So I was kind of lucky to escape that game with a draw. But it was a very exciting game, and something that I'll never forget. So the best move simply for black is nbd7. Why? Because it stops e5, because we can just simply take with the knight this time. If white plays knight f3, black's best move is knight b6, and this basically kills the entire attack, because now white can't play e5 because the bishop is hanging. If white has to retreat the bishop, then black basically just plays g6, bishop g7, castles, and then he usually challenges the knight on a6, which is just very badly placed on b5, just because it has nothing to defend it except for this bishop here, and the knight has no squares to actually move to. So this can be a very scary line. I think that the Zaitsev, and in particular this bishop c4 Nescafé Frappe attack, is based completely on tricks and doesn't really have a sound theoretical value. So there's that line, and then the other line in the Zaitsev is bishop f4. You can see that if knight takes e4 again, queen e2 is just crushing again, because if the knight moves, d6 is falling. So again, you can't be greedy, but you can't be wimpy either, because black's best move in this position is g5. Okay, bishop takes g5, and then white takes back on e4, and he gains a very, very valuable tempo. Because now when bishop f4 is played, theory for a long time considered bishop g7 to be the best move, which I still think is fine, and I'll cover in a subsequent video. But the best move is simply knight f6. We're going to go after this pawn here, and black has very good ways of playing here and ganging up on it, and even bishop to b7. So the d5 pawn ends up becoming a liability. If white goes for that trick that we learned earlier of queen e2, I want you to notice the difference. I'll pause the video, see if you can find the difference as to why is rook a6 okay in this position to defend the d-pawn, and in the previous position it wasn't. So we'll pause it. And the difference, if you were so keen to find this is that this bishop was on c4 in this variation. The fact that the queen is now here blocking this is a big deal. Okay, so now rook a6, and now if knight takes d6, rook takes d6. If we check, black can simply block with the bishop or the knight, frankly. So that's that line. All right. So that's we've covered one of the side lines or accepted lines that quite has a lot of flair, I would say. So after instead of knight to c3, the second one we're going to cover is f3. This is called the Delugi variation. Now with f3, e3, and b6, the next three lines we learn, I'm going to give you two ways to play it. Okay, the typical way to always play this position against any lines is you can just simply copy what you have seen before by basically playing d6, g6, bishop g7, castles, nbd7, and we have a very stereotypical, Benko type of setup. That's always going to be okay in almost any of the variations you play with the Benko, but I've never been one to like that approach. But I think you got to start somewhere, so it does help to learn it. But I like a little bit of an edge to the position, so I never really went for those lines. There are two lines that have an edge. AB has a little bit of an edge to it. After e4, queen a5 check, bishop d2, b4, knight to a3, eyeing this very nice square. Not going to b5 this time, but actually going to c4, d6, knight c4, and queen to d8 is considered the best move. In the New York Open in I want to say 97 or so, I played queen c7, and I actually played queen c7 3 times out of 9 games, which is just amazing that I could actually get a particular line 3 times in a tournament, much less something that we're already on move 9 of a system. Here white plays a3, and there's a boatload of theory. I lost a pretty embarrassing game that's in the database in this variation, but overall I've had pretty good success with this. And then the provocative line, which I've only played online in games, is e6. Instead of AB is e6. This is provocative in that it basically says I'm going to bust open the center, and after e4, e takes d, white has this annoying e5 move. Okay, and if black had to retreat the knight, this d pawn would fall. So fortunately black has queen e7, hitting that pawn. White has to break the pin, and then black plays knight g8. And this position is very complicated, and this is way beyond what we're going to cover today. Okay, but at least you know that it's an option out there. So that's the second variation or way to decline the gambit on move 5. The third one is e3. Again, as I referenced earlier, black can simply play the stereotypical line of playing d6, g6, bishop g7, castles, and nbd7. Same thing we just looked at in the other variation. But of course, there's always the provocative move, which is ab, bishop b5, queen a5 check, knight c3, and bishop b7. In this line, there's quite a lot of theory here, but it's all really, really fun for black to play. The main line is bishop d2, and that gets very provocative, way beyond what we're going to cover today. Knight e2 is also a line which has some punch to it. And then a bad move is just simply bishop c4, and that ends up being bad because you can play e6. And we're exploiting the fact that we're on a pin, but we're also exploiting the fact that white can't play e4 because we'll just simply take. And white can't take here because this g-pawn will fall to the bishop, and then of course the rook falls. Okay, and then the last decline line I wanted to cover on move 5 was simply playing the move b6. Again, I feel like I'm a broken record here. Black can play the stereotypical line of taking on b6 with the queen and then simply playing d6, g6, bishop g7, castles, that kind of stuff. There are some nuances that you have to know. Just note that this looks like a Benko accepted, except clearly it's not because Black has a pawn. He's not down a pawn, but of course there's no pressure on the A file either because the pawn's in the way. Okay, but the reason that this line has sort of fallen out of favor a little bit at the top level is because e6 is just an equalizer. And after knight to c3, Black simply says, I'm going to blow the center up. So takes, 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 queen takes, knight c6. And there's a few moves here. Knight f3 is the most common. Rook to b8. And then white plays e4. Black plays bishop e7. There's no hurry to take this pawn because it's not going anywhere, and white actually has a threat of bishop c4. So we need to be able to castle kingside. Castles kingside. Rook takes b6, which is a nice useful move because it hits this pawn. If white plays b3, which is very common, then black plays d6 with the idea of playing bishop to e6. Objectively, this is equal. If you know what you're doing, I think I would slightly prefer black's position, although in truth this is just an equal type of position. There are a couple games of mine in the database. I lost to Alexander Shabalov in the previous variation in a line of position I'll just show you in a second, and then I've also lost to Alexander Yermolinsky, I think almost in this exact position. But again, it wasn't because of the opening. It's because they were a GM and I'm not. So my game with Grandmaster Shabalov is actually in the database. You can find it. It goes knight e5, and then it just gets insanity with queen f6, knight takes, d takes, and then against Shabalov, the only move that I knew was a move was queen e4 check, but he quickly played played queen f3 here. And I was completely on my own here. I actually came up with a novelty of my own. Bishop e7, bishop d2, and the novelty here is on takes, bishop to c3. The main line was queen a3, and there were actually, after the game I looked it up, and there were a whole bunch of lines with that. But I actually found this move queen c2, which was kind of cool, and Shabalov had not seen this before. And the idea is that if they take on g7, you play c4. And all of a sudden, this is nice and juicy. So Shabalov ended up playing queen here, I want to say. And I avoided the trade and went here because now I'm threatening to win his queen again with this. And this got very, very complicated. It's a very instructive game in the database. I invite you to take a look at it. So hopefully this was helpful for you to learn some get an overview of the Benko Gambit declined on move 5. And again, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll be doing another video very, very soon. So thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.